John 7:27. Sed hunc scimus unde sit, Christus autem convenerit nemo scit unde sit. But we know this man, where he comes from. But when the Christ will have come, no one will know where he comes from. This verse picks up our narrative as the crowd is wondering about many of the things Jesus has just said. This is the crowd in Jerusalem at the feast. And they've just been wondering in particular, can the authorities really know that this is the Christ? Have these people who rule over us, our religious and secular authorities, concluded that this is really the Messiah, this Jesus person, because they don't seem to be stopping him as he's teaching in the temple courts? And this is part of their response. So they're saying, but we know this man, namely where he comes from, unde sit. Now there's two of these constructions in this verse, and we're going to talk about them each in turn. But first, we can note that this is a kind of expression that's a little more paraphrastic or roundabout than the way that we speak in English. Literally, this says, we know him whence he is. That is to say, whence he comes. Now, we would just say in English, we know whence he comes. Scimus unde sit. But this is a more fulsome way of expressing the same thing. You can think of the phrase in the Old King James English version of the Bible, in which Jesus says to his disciples, see the lilies, how they grow. In modern English, we would just say, see how the lilies grow. But this construction foregrounds the thing being considered and then asks a further question about it. It amounts to the same thing, but it's a rather different syntactical formulation than perhaps what we're used to, but it needn't cause us trouble. So we know this man, namely, in particular, we know where he comes from, whence he is, from where. That's the meaning of unde, from where. We know where he comes from. Now, you might ask, why do we have the present subjunctive here of sum esse? And that is, in fact, what we have. Well, the reason is that these both of these unde sit constructions are indirect questions. Now, when a question is reported or relayed or mentioned instead of being directly asked, the verb within the question generally is going to appear in the subjunctive mood. So here we're not saying the direct question, which would be, where does he come from? We're saying, we know where he comes from. So we're reporting a question insofar as we're saying we already know the answer to this question. We're not asking the question, but we're mentioning the form of the question embedded in our own speech. And that prompts this construction, an indirect question with its subjunctive here, present subjunctive, sit. Sed hunc scimus, and of course this is Jesus that they're talking about, but we know this guy, where he comes from. Now it's best probably to put a semicolon here, or even to start a new sentence in English, and say, but autem, however, on the other hand, when what happens? When Christus comes, literally in Latin, because we have here the future perfect form, when he will have come in the future, we're looking ahead to a future state in which this has already happened. That's what the future perfect tense denotes. In English, we just use the future. And we've talked about this before, but Latin is more particular about this than English is. It's more precise. So in English, we would say, but when the Christ comes, namely in the future, but the Latin says literally, when the Christ, the Messiah, shall have come, future perfect indicative from venio venire, when he will have come, then this will happen. No one knows, and note the present tense here. By the way, in the Latin, this is the same as how it works in the Greek. Again, it clashes with English usage. In English, what would we say? We'd say, when the Christ comes, no one will know, right? There we use the future. We have to use the future in English to avoid ambiguity. But here, following the Greek text, the Latin does not. Literally, it says, when the Messiah will have come, no one knows in that circumstance, unde sit. And then we get exactly the same indirect question repeated here. No one will know, we would say in English, whence he comes. No one will know where he comes from.